Sometimes the coldest nights reveal the warmest hearts. Sometimes, when you think you've reached the absolute bottom, life sends you an angel disguised as a stranger. Margaret Rose Thompson learned this truth on a bitter December evening in 1892, standing beside an old stone well with her 3 shivering daughters, watching her breath form clouds in the freezing air as she wondered if this would be their last night together. But what she didn't know was that compassion often arrives when hope seems impossible, carried by gentle souls who understand that true strength is measured not by what we can take, but by what we choose to give. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees surrounding Millbrook Township, carrying with it the promise of the harshest winter Pennsylvania had seen in a decade. Margaret Rose Thompson pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the kitchen window of the boarding house, watching ice crystals form on the glass while her 3 daughters huddled together on the narrow bed they all shared in the cramped room that had been their home for 6 weeks. "Mama, I'm hungry," whispered 8-year-old Lucy, her voice barely audible above the wind that seemed determined to find every crack in the old building's walls. Her auburn hair, so much like her mother's, hung in limp strands around a face that had grown gaunt over the past months. Beside her, 10-year-old Sarah clutched their youngest sister, 5-year-old Emma, trying to share what little warmth their small bodies could generate. Margaret turned from the window, her heart breaking as she looked at her daughters. Sarah, the eldest, had inherited her father's serious brown eyes and his tendency to worry about everyone else before herself. Even at 10, she understood far too much about their desperate circumstances, often going without food to ensure her younger sisters had something to eat. Emma, with her golden curls and blue eyes that still held traces of childhood innocence, had stopped asking when they would go home weeks ago, as if she sensed that home was a concept that no longer applied to their family. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, kneeling beside the bed to smooth Lucy's hair. "Mrs. Patterson said she might have some leftover soup from the dining room." The lie came easily now, born from months of practice in maintaining hope when none existed. Margaret had already asked Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, who had made it clear that charity had its limits, especially for tenants who were 3 weeks behind on rent. The room they occupied was barely large enough for the single bed and washstand it contained, with walls so thin they could hear every conversation, argument, and snore from the adjacent rooms. Margaret had tried to make it feel like home, hanging Emma's few drawings on the cracked plaster walls and arranging their meager possessions with careful attention to creating some semblance of normalcy. But there was no disguising the reality of their situation. They were one step away from the streets, with winter settling in like a predator stalking wounded prey. Margaret's husband, David Thompson, had died 8 months earlier when a construction accident at the new railroad bridge had claimed the lives of 6 men, including the primary breadwinner of their small family. David had been a good man, honest and hard-working, but he'd never been able to save much money on a laborer's wages. When he died, Margaret discovered that the small house they'd rented was tied to his employment, and without his income, she had no way to maintain even their modest lifestyle. The transition from widow to destitute had happened with stunning speed. Margaret had tried to find work, but employment opportunities for women with 3 young children were virtually non-existent in a town where even skilled men struggled to find steady positions. She'd taken in sewing when she could find it, but the pay was so meager that it barely covered food, let alone rent. She'd sold everything of value they owned: David's tools, her mother's china, even her wedding ring, watching their possessions disappear piece by piece as they tried to stretch each dollar as far as possible. The boarding house had been presented as a temporary solution, a place where they could stay while Margaret found work and saved enough money to rent a proper home. Mrs. Patterson had seemed sympathetic initially, allowing them to take the small room with the understanding that payment would come when Margaret found employment. But weeks had turned into months, and Margaret's job prospects had dwindled along with their resources. "Mrs. Thompson?" came a sharp knock at their door, followed by the unmistakable voice of Mrs. Patterson. "I need to speak with you." Margaret exchanged glances with Sarah, who immediately gathered her sisters closer as if she could shield them from whatever conversation was about to unfold. Margaret opened the door to find Mrs. Patterson standing in the narrow hallway, her face set in the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and intended to follow through regardless of the consequences. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said, stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind her to spare her daughters the details of what was surely going to be an unpleasant conversation. "I can't do this anymore," Mrs. Patterson said without preamble. "You're 3 weeks behind on rent, you haven't found work, and winter's coming hard. I've got paying customers who need that room, and I can't afford to run a charity operation." Margaret felt her stomach drop, though she'd been expecting this conversation for days. "I understand your position," she said quietly. "If you could give me just a few more days, I'm sure I can find something." "I've heard that before," Mrs. Patterson interrupted, though her tone wasn't entirely unkind. "Look, Margaret, I know you're trying, but trying doesn't pay my bills or keep this place running. You've got until tomorrow morning to settle your account or find somewhere else to go." The finality in her voice left no room for negotiation. Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. Mrs. Patterson hesitated for a moment, as if she might add something softer, but then she simply turned and walked away, leaving Margaret alone in the dim hallway with the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. Margaret returned to the room where her daughters waited, their faces reflecting the anxiety they'd learned to recognize in adult conversations they couldn't quite understand. She sat on the edge of the bed, gathering them close as she tried to figure out how to explain their situation without destroying what remained of their security. "Are we going to have to leave?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the resignation of a child who'd learned that bad news was more common than good. Margaret looked into her eldest daughter's eyes and saw too much understanding there, too much acceptance of circumstances that no child should have to navigate. "We might need to find a new place to stay," she said carefully, "just for a little while, until things get better." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew that better was becoming an increasingly abstract concept. They had no family to turn to. Both she and David had been only children whose parents had died years earlier. She'd written to David's army friends, but their responses had been sympathetic without being helpful. Men with their own families and financial struggles couldn't take on the responsibility of a widow and 3 children. That evening, as her daughters slept fitfully in the narrow bed, Margaret sat by the window, calculating and recalculating their options. She had exactly $2.37 to her name, along with a few pieces of jewelry that might bring another $1. If she could find someone willing to buy them, even if she managed to scrape together enough money for another week's rent, it would only postpone the inevitable unless she found employment immediately. The job situation in Millbrook was bleak, even for men with skills and connections. The economic panic that had swept the country the previous year had left businesses struggling to survive, and most employers were reducing their workforce rather than expanding it. Margaret had applied for positions as a seamstress, a cook, a cleaning woman, and even a factory worker. But each inquiry had ended with the same response. They couldn't hire someone who would need to bring children to work or leave frequently to care for them. She'd considered writing to the county about assistance, but the shame of it felt overwhelming. Margaret had been raised to believe that hard work and moral character were sufficient to overcome any obstacle, and the idea of accepting charity seemed like an admission of failure that she wasn't ready to make. More practically, she'd heard that the county assistance program required families to be separated, with children sent to different institutions while parents sought work elsewhere. As dawn approached, Margaret made the decision that would change everything that followed. She gathered their few remaining possessions, a change of clothes for each daughter, David's Bible, and a small wooden box containing the last of her mother's letters, and packed them into the carpet bag that had once seemed adequate for brief travels, but now contained everything they owned in the world. "Where are we going, Mama?" Emma asked as Margaret helped her into her coat, which had grown too large as the little girl lost weight over the past months. "We're going to find a better place," Margaret replied, though she had no idea where that place might be. "Somewhere warmer and happier." They left the boarding house as the sun rose over Millbrook, walking through streets that Margaret had once navigated with confidence, but now seemed foreign and unwelcoming. The December air was sharp enough to cut, and she could see her daughters, breath-forming small clouds as they struggled to keep up with her determined pace. Margaret's plan, such as it was, involved walking to the next town where she hoped to find work and shelter before nightfall. But as the morning progressed, it became clear that her daughters weren't strong enough for such a journey. Lucy began stumbling after the first hour, and even Sarah's determined efforts to keep moving were hampered by exhaustion and hunger. By midday, they had barely traveled 3 miles from Millbrook, and Margaret realized that they needed to rest and reconsider their options. They stopped at a small crossroads, where an old stone well stood beside a wooden signpost pointing toward various destinations that might as well have been on the moon for all the good they did a family without resources. Margaret drew water from the well, grateful that it hadn't frozen solid, and shared it with her daughters using the tin cup that was one of their few remaining possessions. The water was cold enough to make their teeth ache, but it was clean and free, which made it precious in their current circumstances. As afternoon faded into evening, Margaret faced the reality that they had nowhere to go. The next town was still, hours away, too far for her daughters to walk in their weakened condition and winter clothing that provided inadequate protection against the dropping temperature. Behind them lay Millbrook, where they were no longer welcome. Ahead stretched an uncertain road toward communities where they had no connections and no guarantee of finding help. The decision to spend the night by the well wasn't really a decision at all, but rather the acceptance of circumstances beyond her control. Margaret gathered her daughters close, wrapping her own coat around all 3 of them while trying to shield them from the wind that seemed determined to find every gap in their defenses. "Tell us a story, Mama," Lucy whispered, her lips already turning blue from the cold. Margaret searched her mind for something hopeful, something that might distract her daughters from their discomfort and fear. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "there was a family who got lost in a great forest. They were cold and tired and didn't know which way to go. But just when they thought they couldn't take another step, they saw a light shining through the trees." As she spoke, Margaret found herself believing in the story she was telling, drawing strength from the act of creating hope, even in their darkest moment. Her daughters pressed closer, their small bodies seeking warmth and comfort that she desperately wished she could provide more effectively. The temperature continued to drop as full darkness settled over the crossroads, and Margaret realized that survival until morning was no longer guaranteed. They were truly alone now, with no resources except their love for each other, and whatever strength they could draw from that bond. But sometimes, in the moments when hope seems most impossible, the universe conspires to remind us that we are not as alone as we believe. And sometimes rescue comes not in the form we expect, but in the form we need most. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The stars emerged one by one in the crystalline December sky, their cold light offering beauty, but no warmth to the small family huddled beside the stone well. Margaret felt Emma's breathing become shallow and rapid against her chest, a sign that worried her more than her own increasing numbness. The little girl's lips had taken on a bluish tinge that spoke of the body's desperate struggle to preserve vital functions, and Margaret knew they were running out of time. "Mama, I can't feel my feet," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying the forced calm of a child trying to be brave. At 10 years old, she understood enough about their situation to recognize danger without fully comprehending its implications. Margaret shifted position carefully, trying to redistribute her coat to better cover all 3 daughters without losing what little warmth they'd managed to generate. The movement sent sharp pains through her legs, which had gone numb from sitting in the same position for hours, but she bit back any sound that might alarm the children. "Try wiggling your toes inside your shoes," she suggested quietly, though. She knew Sarah's worn boots provided little protection against the frozen ground. "And tell me about the house you want to live in someday, the one with the big kitchen and the garden." It was a game they'd played during the worst nights at the boarding house, creating elaborate fantasies about the home they would have when their circumstances improved. Sarah had always described a house with windows that caught the morning, sun and enough bedrooms for each sister to have her own space, while Lucy dreamed of a porch swing and Emma wanted a yard where she could keep a kitten. "It would have a fireplace," Sarah said, her teeth chattering despite her efforts to control them. "A big one made of stone, with logs that crackle and make the whole room smell like Christmas." "And warm quilts," Lucy added, snuggling closer to her sisters. "Thick ones that Grammy would have made if she was still here." Margaret closed her eyes, drawing strength from her daughter's ability to find hope even in their darkest hour. David's mother had indeed been a wonderful quilter, and Margaret could almost feel the weight of the beautiful bedding that had been sold months ago to pay for medicine during Emma's bout with pneumonia. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Margaret's eyes snap open, her body tensing with a mixture of hope and fear. A lone rider was approaching along the main road, his horse picking its way carefully over the rutted, frozen ground. In the starlight, Margaret could make out the silhouette of a man wearing a heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat, but she couldn't determine whether he represented salvation or potential danger. Her instinct was to gather the children and move away from the road, but they were too weak to flee, and the well provided their only source of water. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and prepared to face whatever this encounter might bring, determined to protect her daughters regardless of the cost. The rider slowed as he approached the crossroads, his attention apparently caught by the unusual sight of a family camped beside the well on such a bitter night. Margaret could feel his gaze taking in their situation, the carpet bag that contained their worldly possessions, the children huddled under her inadequate coat, the undeniable signs of desperation that no amount of dignity could completely disguise. "Evening, ma'am," the stranger said, his voice carrying a gentle courtesy that immediately distinguished him from the kind of men Margaret had learned to fear during their weeks of vulnerability. He dismounted with fluid grace, his movements suggesting someone comfortable with both horses and the frontier conditions that shaped life in rural Pennsylvania. "Good evening," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She could see him more clearly now, a man in his 30s with kind eyes and weathered features that spoke of someone who spent his days working outdoors. His clothes were practical rather than fancy, but they were well made and warm, suggesting modest prosperity rather than wealth. "Mighty cold night to be traveling," he observed, though his tone held concern rather than judgment. "Horse through. A shoe about a mile back, so I'm moving slower than I'd planned. Name's Benjamin Carter." "Margaret Thompson," she replied. instinctively tightening her arms around her daughters as they stirred at the sound of an unfamiliar voice. "These are my daughters, Sarah, Lucy, and Emma." Benjamin touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, his gaze taking in the children's pale faces and the telltale signs of hunger and exhaustion that no mother's love could completely hide. Margaret saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that seemed to deepen his concern rather than prompt him to continue on his way. "Mrs. Thompson," he said carefully, "forgive me for asking, but are you folks in some kind of trouble? It's not safe to be out in weather like this, especially with young ones." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. Admitting their desperate circumstances to a stranger felt like the final surrender of the independence she'd been fighting to maintain. But Emma's increasingly labored breathing reminded her that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. "We're traveling," she said finally, the partial truth easier to speak than the complete honesty their situation demanded. "We had to leave our previous accommodation rather suddenly." Benjamin's expression suggested he understood far more than her carefully chosen words revealed. He glanced at the carpet bag, the children's inadequate clothing, and the way Margaret's own coat hung loose on her frame, all evidence of a family that had been forced to leave behind more than just accommodation. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I don't mean to intrude, but that little one doesn't sound good, and begging your pardon, but none of you look like you've had a proper meal in some time." Margaret felt tears threaten for the first time since they'd left Millbrook. The stranger's kindness was almost harder to bear than the coldness they'd encountered from others, because it acknowledged their humanity at a moment when she'd begun to wonder if they'd become invisible in their desperation. "We're managing," she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Margaret to each of her daughters, with the careful assessment of someone making an important decision. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to taking action when action was needed. "Mrs. Thompson, I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and there's food. My housekeeper, Mrs. O'Brien, she's got a way with children and a heart bigger than this whole county." He paused, then added with gentle firmness, "Those girls need shelter and you need help. I'd consider it an honor if you'd let me provide both." Margaret stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. Strangers didn't make such offers, especially not to destitute women with children. There had to be conditions, expectations, some price. That would make the kindness less generous than it appeared. I couldn't impose," she said automatically, the response ingrained by years of proper upbringing that had taught her to refuse charity even when desperately needed. "We don't have any way to repay such kindness." "No repayment expected," Benjamin replied simply. "Sometimes folks need help, and sometimes other folks are in a position to provide it. Right now, you need what I can offer, and that's enough reason for me." As if to emphasize his point, Emma began coughing, a harsh, dry sound that spoke of lungs struggling against the cold. Benjamin's jaw tightened with concern, and Margaret saw him reach a decision that removed any further discussion from the equation. Without another word, he began unbuttoning his heavy coat, revealing a thick wool sweater underneath that would still provide him adequate protection for the short term. The coat was beautifully made, lined with what appeared to be genuine fur, clearly an expensive garment that represented significant value. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked, alarmed by his actions. "What needs doing?" Benjamin replied, shaking out the coat before approaching the huddled family. "Little ones are freezing, and I've got warmth to spare." He draped the coat over all 3 daughters, the garment so large that it covered them completely while retaining the heat from his body. The immediate relief on their faces was unmistakable. Emma's breathing began to ease, and Lucy stopped the violent shivering that had been shaking her small frame. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, the first words she'd spoken directly to the stranger. "It's so warm." "You're welcome, sweetheart," Benjamin replied, his voice carrying the gentle tone of someone comfortable around children. "That'll keep you comfortable until we get you somewhere proper." Margaret felt her last reserves of resistance crumble as she watched her daughters' faces relax for the first time in hours. Whatever Benjamin Carter's motivations might be, his immediate concern was clearly for their welfare rather than his own comfort or convenience. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "I don't understand why you're helping us. You don't know anything about us, about our circumstances." Benjamin met her gaze directly, his eyes holding a sincerity that seemed to reach past her defenses to the frightened woman beneath the protective mother's facade. "Mrs. Thompson, I know you're a mother trying to protect her children. I know those little girls are cold and hungry and scared. I know you've been carrying burdens that no one should have to carry alone." He paused, then added with quiet conviction, "Sometimes that's all we need to know about someone." The simplicity of his statement cut through all of Margaret's complex fears and calculations. Here was a man who saw their need and responded with practical compassion, asking nothing in return except the opportunity to help. It was so different from every other encounter they'd had since David's death that it felt almost like a miracle. "Come with me," Benjamin said gently, extending his hand toward Margaret while his other hand reached for their carpet bag. "Let's get you and your daughters somewhere safe and warm." Margaret looked at his outstretched hand, understanding that accepting it meant more than just physical assistance. It meant acknowledging their desperate need, abandoning the pretense of independence that had sustained her through months of struggle, and trusting a stranger with the most precious things in her world, her daughters' lives. But as she felt, Emma's breathing continued to improve under the warmth of Benjamin's coat, and saw the hope beginning to return to Sarah's and Lucy's faces, Margaret realized that some decisions made themselves. She reached out and took Benjamin Carter's hand, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip as he helped her to her feet. In that moment, as she committed herself and her daughters to the kindness of a stranger, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that their story might not end in tragedy after all. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of gratitude too deep for adequate expression. Benjamin simply nodded, understanding that some moments required action rather than words. He lifted Emma onto his horse first, the little girl so light that he handled her with the care one might show a wounded bird, then helped Sarah and Lucy climb up behind her. Margaret watched her daughters settle into the saddle, wrapped in Benjamin's coat like precious cargo being prepared for a journey to safety. "Can you walk a bit further?" Benjamin asked Margaret, his concern evident as he noted her own exhaustion. "It's not far, and the horse can't carry all of us safely." "I can walk," Margaret replied, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. The prospect of warmth and shelter for her daughters gave her strength she hadn't known she still possessed. As they began the journey toward Benjamin's ranch, Margaret found herself walking beside a man who had appeared at their darkest moment like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. The night air was still bitter, but the promise of sanctuary ahead made each step possible. Behind them, the stone well stood silent in the starlight, witness to the moment when desperation had met compassion and 4 lives had been forever changed. By the simple power of human kindness offered without condition or expectation of return. The journey to Benjamin's ranch took them along a winding dirt road that climbed gradually through rolling hills dotted with bare oak trees. Margaret's legs trembled with each step, but the sight of her 3 daughters wrapped safely in Benjamin's coat, their faces no longer pinched with cold, gave her the strength to continue. The horse moved at a careful pace, Benjamin walking alongside, while keeping one hand on the reins and casting frequent glances at Margaret to ensure she could maintain the pace. "Not much further now," Benjamin said quietly as they crested a small hill. "Just over that next rise." In the distance, Margaret could see the warm glow of windows cutting through the darkness, a sight that seemed almost mythical after the long hours of uncertainty. The lights promised warmth, safety, and the kind of ordinary domestic comfort that had become foreign concepts during their weeks of struggle. As they drew closer, the ranch revealed itself to be a substantial operation, larger and more prosperous than Margaret had expected. The main house was a solid two-story structure built from local stone and timber, with wide porches and dormant flower beds that spoke of someone who took pride in their home. Several outbuildings were arranged around a central yard, including a large barn, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be quarters for ranch hands. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, struck by the sense of permanence and security the place projected. Everything about the ranch suggested careful planning and patient investment, the kind of establishment that could weather difficult seasons and provide stability for generations. "My father built the original house," Benjamin explained as they approached the main building. "I've added to it over the years as the operation grew. We run cattle mostly, some horses, enough crops to keep everyone fed." The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked brown hair and the kind of competent bearing that suggested she was accustomed to managing both household and crisis with equal efficiency. She wore a practical dark dress covered by a spotless white apron, and her sharp eyes immediately took in the scene before her with the rapid assessment of someone who had seen trouble arrive at her door before. "Benjamin Carter, what have you brought us?" she asked, though her tone held warmth rather than criticism. Her slight Irish accent added a musical quality to words that might have sounded harsh from another speaker. "Mrs. O'Brien, this is Mrs. Thompson and her 3 daughters," Benjamin replied, carefully lifting Emma down from the horse. "They've had some hard traveling and need shelter for the night." Mrs. O'Brien's expression softened immediately as she saw the children's pale faces and the way they huddled together despite the warmth of Benjamin's coat. "Of course they do, poor lambs. Bring them inside this instant before they catch their death." The interior of the house was a revelation of comfort and abundance that struck Margaret with almost overwhelming force. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace where a cheerful fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on walls, lined with bookshelves and family photographs. Comfortable chairs were arranged around the hearth, and the air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke, baking bread, and the kind of cleanliness that spoke of a well-maintained home. "Sit here by the fire," Mrs. O'Brien instructed, guiding the children to a large sofa positioned to catch the maximum warmth from the flames. "I'll have hot soup ready in just a few minutes, and there's fresh bread in the kitchen." Margaret sank into a chair beside her daughters, hardly daring to believe that such comfort was real. The heat from the fireplace seemed to penetrate not just her cold body, but the very core of despair that had been growing stronger with each passing day. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to truly relax, letting the chair support her weight instead of maintaining the constant vigilance that had become second nature. "When did you last eat?" Mrs. O'Brien asked, her experienced eye noting the way the children devoured the warm milk and bread she'd quickly prepared while the soup heated. "Yesterday morning," Margaret admitted, the confession easier now that immediate hunger was being addressed. "We had a bit of bread and some water from the well." Mrs. O'Brien and Benjamin exchanged meaningful glances, and Margaret saw something pass between them that spoke of shared understanding and mutual respect. These were people who had worked together long enough to communicate without words, partners in the kind of household management that required both practical skills and genuine care for others. "The soup's ready," Mrs. O'Brien announced, returning from the kitchen with a large tureen that filled the room with the aroma of beef, vegetables, and herbs. real beef soup with potatoes and carrots from our own garden, preserved from the fall harvest. The meal that followed was a revelation of abundance that the Thompson family had almost forgotten existed. Mrs. O'Brien served generous portions in beautiful china bowls, accompanied by thick slices of homemade bread spread with fresh butter and honey. There was milk so rich it bore a cream line, and coffee strong enough to chase away the last traces of cold from Margaret's bones. Emma, who had eaten sparingly for weeks, managed to finish an entire bowl of soup and asked for seconds, with the shy politeness of a child who had learned not to expect such generosity. Lucy and Sarah ate with the focused intensity of the truly hungry, their color returning as warmth and nourishment combined to restore their strength. "You're excellent cooks, Mrs. O'Brien," Margaret said, meaning every word. "This is the best. A meal we've had in a very long time. Food tastes better when it's shared with people who need it," Mrs. O'Brien replied, bustling around the table to ensure everyone had enough. "Benjamin always says this house is too big for just the two of us rattling around in it." Margaret noticed the easy familiarity between Benjamin and his housekeeper, the way they moved around each other in the domestic space with the coordination of people who had shared responsibility for years. There was respect and affection in their interactions, but also clear boundaries that spoke of a professional relationship built on mutual trust rather than mere employment. "Mrs. O'Brien has been running this household since before my father died," Benjamin explained, seeing Margaret's curious glance. "I don't know what I'd do without her organization and good sense." "Probably starve," Mrs. O'Brien said tartly, though her smile softened the criticism. "This man thinks beans and hardtack constitute adequate nutrition for a working ranch." As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't experienced since David's death. The combination of warmth, food, and genuine hospitality created an atmosphere of safety that allowed her to set aside the constant vigilance that had become her default state. Her daughters responded even more dramatically, their personalities emerging from the protective shell that months of insecurity had created. Sarah, usually so serious and worried, began asking Benjamin about the ranch operation with genuine curiosity. "How many cows do you have? Do you ever see wild animals? Are there really Indians around here like people say?" Benjamin answered her questions with patient thoroughness, treating her inquiries with the respect he might show an adult while keeping his explanations appropriate for a 10-year-old's understanding. Margaret watched this interaction with growing appreciation, recognizing in Benjamin the rare adult who understood that children's questions deserved serious consideration rather than dismissive responses. Lucy, emboldened by the warm atmosphere, began chattering about her hopes for Christmas, which was only weeks away. "Mama said we might not have presents this year because we're traveling, but maybe Santa will find us anyway?" Margaret felt her heart clench at the innocent hope in her daughter's voice, knowing that Christmas presents were an impossibility given their circumstances. But Mrs. O'Brien caught her eye and gave a slight nod that suggested Lucy's wish might not be as impossible as Margaret feared. Emma, the youngest and most affected by their recent hardships, gradually came to life as the warmth and food worked their restorative magic. She accepted a wooden horse that Benjamin carved for her during the evening, holding it with the reverence of a child who had few toys and treasured each one accordingly. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her small fingers over the smooth wood. "What's his name?" "That's for you to decide," Benjamin replied seriously. "Every horse needs a name that fits his personality." As the evening wound down, Mrs. O'Brien began making preparations for the night. "I've got the guest rooms ready," she announced, addressing Margaret directly. "The blue room has a double bed that will be perfect for you and Emma. And the rose room has twin beds for Sarah and Lucy. There's clean nightclothes laid out and hot water for washing. Margaret felt tears threaten again, overwhelmed by the kindness that kept exceeding her ability to process it. Guest rooms with clean linens, hot water for washing, night clothes that didn't need to be slept in, these were luxuries she'd taken for granted during her married life, but had seemed impossibly distant during recent weeks. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice barely steady. "Both of you. This kindness it's beyond anything I could have hoped for." "No thanks needed," Benjamin said firmly. "Tomorrow we can talk about what comes next, but tonight you and your daughters are safe and warm. That's what matters." As Mrs. O'Brien led them upstairs to the guest rooms, Margaret caught her first glimpse of the upper floor of the house. The hallway was wide and well lit, with family photographs lining the walls, and a sense of established comfort that spoke of generations of careful tending. The guest rooms were beautifully appointed with handmade quilts, fresh flowers in small vases, and windows that promised pleasant views when morning came. "There's a washroom at the end of the hall with a proper bathtub," Mrs. O'Brien explained, as she showed them the accommodations. "I've set out clean towels and soap, and there's a nightgown for each of you that should fit well enough for sleeping." The blue room where Margaret would sleep with Emma was larger than their entire accommodation at the boarding house, with a window seat that looked out over the ranch's main yard and comfortable chairs arranged around a small fireplace. The bed was covered with a wedding ring quilt in shades of blue and white, and the pillows were plump with down that promised the kind of comfortable sleep that had become a distant memory. "Mrs. O'Brien," Margaret said quietly, as the older woman prepared to leave them for the night, "why are you doing this? Why is Benjamin doing this? You don't know us, don't know our circumstances or our character." Mrs. O'Brien paused in the doorway, her expression thoughtful as she considered her response. "Child," she said finally, "there are times when people need help, and times when other people are in a position to provide it. When those times coincide, it's not charity, it's community. It's what we do for each other when the world gets too hard to bear alone." She paused, then added with a gentle smile, "Besides, Benjamin's father taught him that a man's worth is measured not by what he accumulates, but by what he's willing to share when sharing is needed. This house has seen its share of travelers who needed shelter, and it's been blessed by every one of them." After Mrs. O'Brien left them alone, Margaret helped her daughters wash and change into the clean nightgowns that had been provided. The simple act of getting clean felt like a rebirth, washing away not just the dirt of their journey, but some of the despair that had accumulated during their weeks of struggle. "Mama," Sarah said as they prepared for bed, "are we going to stay here?" Margaret looked at her eldest daughter, seeing in her eyes the hope that she was afraid to voice too clearly. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly. "We'll have to see what tomorrow brings." But as she tucked her daughters into beds with clean sheets and warm quilts, as she listened to their breathing settle into the peaceful rhythm of children who felt safe, Margaret found herself daring to hope that tomorrow might bring possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. Outside their window, the ranch slept peacefully under a canopy of stars that no longer seemed cold and distant, but rather like benevolent witnesses to the miracle of human kindness. For the first time in months, Margaret drifted off to sleep without the weight of immediate fear pressing on her consciousness, surrounded by warmth, comfort, and the revolutionary idea that their story might have a happy ending after all. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains and the sound of voices drifting up from the kitchen below. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts as she tried to place herself in surroundings that felt like a dream after months of harsh reality. The bed was soft, the room warm, and Emma slept peacefully beside her, her breathing clear and steady for the first time in weeks. The luxury of waking without immediate crisis felt foreign, almost guilty. Margaret had grown so accustomed to anxiety as her first conscious emotion that the absence of pressing fear left her feeling strangely unmoored. She lay still, listening to the comfortable sounds of a household beginning its daily routine, the clink of dishes, Mrs. O'Brien's cheerful humming, and deeper voices that suggested the ranch hands were gathering for breakfast. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Thompson." Mrs. O'Brien's voice carried gentle concern. "I brought some clothes that might fit you and the girls, and breakfast is ready whenever you are." Margaret sat up carefully, not wanting to wake Emma, and opened the door to find Mrs. O'Brien holding an armful of neatly folded garments. The older woman's eyes immediately assessed Margaret's condition with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to caring for others. "You look better already," Mrs. O'Brien observed with satisfaction. "A good night's sleep works wonders." These belonged to Benjamin's sister before she married and moved to California. She was about your size, and there are some things that should fit the girls as well. The dresses Mrs. O'Brien offered were simple but well made, constructed from quality fabric in colors that would complement Margaret's auburn hair and fair complexion. There was also a warm wool coat that would provide far better protection than the threadbare shawl Margaret had been wearing. "I couldn't possibly," Margaret began automatically, the ingrained response of someone who had learned that accepting too much kindness often came with unexpected costs. "Nonsense," Mrs. O'Brien replied briskly. "They're just sitting in trunks, gathering dust, and Benjamin's sister would be pleased to know they're being put to good use. Besides," she added with a knowing smile, "you can't very well help with the household wearing a nightgown, can you?" The assumption that Margaret would naturally contribute to the household work struck her as both surprising and reassuring. It suggested that Mrs. O'Brien saw her as a capable woman temporarily in need, rather than a helpless charity case, and it offered the possibility of earning her keep through useful labor rather than existing as a burden on their host's generosity. "Help with the household?" Margaret asked, wanting to understand the expectations clearly. "Well, of course," Mrs. O'Brien said, as if the matter were obvious. "This place doesn't run itself, and with winter coming on, there's plenty of work for everyone. Can you cook, sew, manage accounts?" The question stirred something in Margaret that had been dormant since David's death, a sense of her own competence and value beyond her role as a mother in crisis. "I can do all of those things," she said, surprised by the confidence in her own voice. "I managed our household accounts for years, and I did alterations and dressmaking to supplement David's income." "Excellent," Mrs. O'Brien declared with genuine pleasure. "Benjamin's hopeless with the account books, and I could use help with the mending. Some of those ranch hands are harder on their clothes than a pack of wild animals." As Margaret dressed, in clothes that fit properly and made her feel human again, she found herself thinking about the radical shift in her circumstances. 24 hours earlier, she had been sitting by a frozen well with no prospects except slow death from exposure. Now she was putting on clean clothes in a warm room while discussing meaningful work with someone who treated her as an equal rather than an object of pity. The kitchen, when she reached it with Emma in tow, was a marvel of organized efficiency. Mrs. O'Brien moved between the large cast-iron stove and a work table that could have served a restaurant, preparing what appeared to be breakfast for a small army. The air was rich with the scents of bacon, fresh biscuits and coffee, strong enough to fortify anyone facing a day of outdoor work. Sarah and Lucy were already seated at a long wooden table, their faces bright with the kind of animation that good food and security could restore to children. They wore simple dresses that had been altered to fit their small frames, and their hair had been brushed and braided with the attention to detail that spoke of someone who understood the importance of dignity along with basic care. "Good morning, Mama," Sarah said, jumping up to embrace her mother. "Mrs. O'Brien showed us how to feed the chickens, and there are kittens in the barn, and Benjamin said maybe we could learn to ride horses if we're good." The rapid-fire excitement in her daughter's voice was a sound Margaret hadn't heard in months. Sarah had been forced to grow up too quickly during their recent troubles, taking on responsibilities and worries that belonged to adults rather than children. To see her acting like a normal 10-year-old again was worth more than any material comfort their hosts could provide. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret replied, smoothing Sarah's hair while marveling at the transformation in all her daughters. They looked healthy, clean, and most importantly, they looked hopeful. Benjamin appeared in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand, and dressed for outdoor work. His greeting was warm but respectful, acknowledging their changed circumstances without making Margaret feel either obligated or uncomfortable. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson. I trust you all slept well?" "Better than we have in months," Margaret replied honestly. "I can't begin to express our gratitude for your kindness." "No need for gratitude among neighbors," Benjamin said, echoing Mrs. O'Brien's philosophy from the previous evening, "though I was hoping we might talk about what comes next, when you're ready." The conversation Margaret had been both anticipating and dreading could no longer be postponed. She needed to understand what Benjamin and Mrs. O'Brien expected from their arrangement, what her options might be, and how long their sanctuary might last. "I'm ready now," she said, settling Emma at the table with a plate of eggs and biscuits. While meeting Benjamin's gaze directly, they moved to the main room where the fire still crackled cheerfully, providing both warmth and a sense of privacy from the kitchen's bustle. Benjamin took the chair across from her, his manner serious but not unkind, as he considered how to begin. "Mrs. Thompson," he said finally, "I don't want to pry into matters that aren't my business, but it's clear that you and your daughters have been through some difficult times. If you're comfortable sharing, it would help me understand how best to assist you." Margaret took a deep breath, realizing that honesty would serve her better than the partial truths she'd been offering. Benjamin had already demonstrated his trustworthiness through actions rather than words, and she owed him the respect of complete candor. She told him everything: David's death, the loss of their home, her unsuccessful search for employment, the mounting debts that had consumed their savings, and finally their eviction from the boarding house. She spoke without self-pity, presenting the facts with the clarity of someone who had learned to face unpleasant realities without flinching. Benjamin listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful as he understood the full scope of their situation. When she finished, he was quiet for several minutes, apparently considering various possibilities before responding. "You mentioned that you kept household accounts and did alterations," he said eventually. "Would you be interested in doing similar work here, for wages?" The offer was so unexpected that Margaret wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "Wages," she repeated. "The ranch generates more paperwork than I can manage alone," Benjamin explained. "Cattle sales, feed purchases, payroll for the hands, correspondence with buyers in Chicago and Denver. I've been meaning to hire someone to help with the administrative side, but it's hard to find people with both the skills and the trustworthiness such work requires." Margaret felt her heart begin to race with possibility. Real employment, using skills she possessed, in a place where her daughters would be safe and cared for. It seemed too good to be true. "And the sewing?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "Mrs. O'Brien's been complaining for years about the mending," Benjamin said with a slight smile. "Ranch hands are particular hard on their clothes, and we've been sending everything to town for repairs. If you could handle that work here, it would save money and ensure things got done properly." The practical nature of his offer reassured Margaret that this was genuine employment, rather than disguised charity. Benjamin was presenting her with work that needed doing, offering wages for valuable services, rather than creating artificial positions to salve his conscience. "What about my daughters?" she asked, the practical mother asserting herself even as hope began to bloom. "Children belong where their mother is," Benjamin said simply. "This house is big enough for a family, and Mrs. O'Brien's been saying for years that it's too quiet around here. As for schooling, There's a good teacher in town who comes out to the ranches during winter months when travel is easier. The comprehensive nature of his solution suggested that Benjamin had been thinking about their situation seriously, considering not just immediate needs, but long-term stability. Margaret found herself looking at a future that included meaningful work, adequate shelter, her daughter's education, and the kind of security she'd thought was permanently beyond their reach. The wages would be fair, Benjamin continued, naming a sum that was more than generous for the work described. Room and board included, of course, and Mrs. O'Brien would be delighted to have help with the household management. Margaret struggled to find words adequate to the moment. The transformation from desperate refugee to valued employee felt like stepping through a doorway into an entirely different life, one where her skills were appreciated and her daughter's futures were secure. "I accept," she said quietly. Then, with growing confidence, "I accept your offer, Mr. Carter, and I promise you won't regret giving us this opportunity." Benjamin's smile was warm and genuine. "I don't think I will, Mrs. Thompson. In fact, I suspect this arrangement will benefit all of us." The remainder of the morning was spent in practical discussions about Margaret's new responsibilities. Benjamin showed her the ranch office, a well-organized room adjacent to the main house where ledgers, correspondence, and business records were kept with methodical precision. The work was extensive but manageable, requiring exactly the kind of detailed attention and organizational skills that Margaret had developed during her years of household management. "My father started keeping records like this when he first established the ranch," Benjamin explained as he walked her through the various account books. "Said a man who didn't know his business in detail was a man headed for failure." Margaret examined the neat columns of figures, the careful tracking of expenses and income, and felt a familiar satisfaction at seeing complex information organized clearly. This was work she could not only perform, but excel at, contributing genuine value to the ranch's operation rather than merely existing as a dependent. The sewing work proved equally promising. Mrs. O'Brien led her to a bright room on the second floor that had been set up as a workroom, complete with a good sewing machine, adequate storage, and excellent natural light from large windows facing south. "I've been keeping the worst of the mending in baskets," Mrs. O'Brien admitted, indicating several containers filled with work shirts, pants, and other garments in various states of disrepair. "Some of it's beyond saving, but most just needs someone with skill and patience to make it serviceable again." Margaret examined the work with a practiced eye, mentally cataloguing the repairs that would be required and estimating the time each garment would need. It was substantial work, but work she understood thoroughly and could complete to high standards. As the day progressed, Margaret found herself settling into the rhythm of her new life with surprising ease. Her daughters adapted even more quickly, with Sarah helping Mrs. O'Brien in the kitchen, Lucy discovering the barn cats, and Emma following Benjamin around the yard while he tended to various chores with patient good humor. The evening brought a family dinner around the large kitchen, or table, with the ranch hands joining them for a meal that felt more like a gathering of extended family than an employer feeding his workers. The conversation was lively and inclusive, with Margaret and her daughters treated as established members of the household rather than temporary guests. "Mrs. Thompson's going to be helping with the ranch accounts," Benjamin announced during the meal, his tone making it clear that this was a significant and valued addition to their operation. The response from the ranch hands was immediate and positive. "About time," declared Jake Morrison, the lead hand. "No offense, boss, but your handwriting's harder to read than chicken scratches, and your filing system needs a woman's touch." The gentle teasing and immediate acceptance of her new role filled Margaret with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the nearby hearth. These men were welcoming her as a colleague, acknowledging her value to their shared enterprise. As the evening wound down and her daughters prepared for their second night of safe, comfortable sleep, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. Less than 48 hours earlier, she had been convinced that their story would end in tragedy beside a frozen well. Now she was part of a working household, contributing her skills to a thriving enterprise, while her daughters laughed and played with the freedom of children who felt secure. The transformation seemed miraculous, but Margaret was beginning to understand that miracles often wore the disguise of ordinary human kindness, extended by people who understood that community. Strength came from caring for those in need. Benjamin Carter and Mrs. O'Brien hadn't just offered charity. They had offered dignity, purpose, and the chance to rebuild lives that had seemed irreparably broken. As she tucked her daughters into their beds, listening to their excited chatter about horses and kittens and the promise of Christmas, Margaret allowed herself to believe that their future might hold possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The gentle rancher who had taken off his coat and said, "Come with me," had offered them more than shelter from the storm. He had offered them home. 3 weeks into their new life at the Carter Ranch, Margaret had established a routine that brought her more satisfaction than she'd experienced since David's death. Her mornings began before dawn in the ranch office, where she worked through correspondence and account books while the house remained quiet around her. The administrative work proved both challenging and rewarding, requiring her to master the complexities of cattle markets, feed costs, and seasonal planning that governed successful ranch operations. Benjamin had been right about his father's meticulous record-keeping. The ledgers revealed a business built on careful attention to detail and long-term planning rather than speculation or luck. Margaret found herself absorbed in the patterns of income and expense, discovering inefficiencies that could be corrected and opportunities that might be developed. "You've found the discrepancy in the feed costs," Benjamin said one morning, reviewing her work with obvious approval. "I've been puzzling over those numbers for months." Margaret pointed to the columns where she'd traced the problem. "The supplier in town has been charging different rates for the same grade of feed, depending on delivery schedules. If we coordinate our orders with the Jenkins Ranch and the Morrison Place, we can qualify for bulk pricing that would save nearly 15%. Benjamin studied her calculations with growing respect. "That's exceptional work, Mrs. Thompson. I never would have thought to cross-reference the delivery schedules that way." The praise warmed Margaret in ways that went beyond professional satisfaction. She was contributing genuine value to the ranch's success, using skills that had been dismissed as merely domestic during her marriage, but were proving essential in the broader context of business management. Her sewing work had proven equally successful. The mending that had accumulated in Mrs. O'Brien's baskets was yielding to her systematic approach, with garments emerging from her workroom restored to better condition than many had enjoyed when new. Word of her skill had spread among neighboring ranches, and she'd begun taking in additional work that supplemented her wages while building a reputation for quality craftsmanship. Mrs. Patterson, from the Double Bar, sent over 3 shirts that need complete reconstruction, Mrs. O'Brien reported during their morning planning session. "Said she'd heard you could work miracles with a needle and thread." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that Mrs. Patterson, who had evicted them from her boarding house, was now seeking her services. But she approached the work without bitterness, understanding that survival in their new circumstances required focusing on the future rather than dwelling on past injuries. Her daughters had adapted to ranch life with the resilience that children often displayed when their basic needs were met and their environment was secure. Sarah had become Mrs. O'Brien's devoted assistant, learning cooking techniques and household management skills that would serve her well in adulthood. Her serious nature found perfect expression in the responsibility of helping manage the ranch's Domestic operations. Sarah's got a natural talent for organization, Mrs. O'Brien confided to Margaret one afternoon. Give her a pantry to arrange or a menu to plan, and she approaches it like a general planning a campaign. Lucy had discovered her affinity for animals, spending her free time in the barn with the horses and developing a particular attachment to a gentle mare named Rosie. Benjamin had begun teaching her basic horsemanship, and her confidence in the saddle was growing daily. She's got good instincts, Jake Morrison observed, watching Lucy practice her riding in the corral. Horses respond to her because she's patient and gentle. Not every child has that gift. Emma, the youngest, had attached herself to Benjamin with the devotion of a child who had found a father figure. She followed him on his rounds when weather permitted, learning about ranch operations through observation and endless questions that he answered with unfailing patience. "Why do the cows stay together?" she asked one morning, perched on a fence post while Benjamin checked the herd. "They're herd animals," Benjamin explained seriously. "They feel safer in groups, and they look out for each other, just like families do." Margaret, watching from the ranch house porch, felt her heart contract at the easy affection between her youngest daughter and the man who had rescued them all. Emma had been too young to remember her father clearly, and seeing her blossom under Benjamin's gentle guidance filled Margaret with gratitude, complicated by deeper emotions she wasn't ready to examine. The complications began to surface during the fourth week of December, as the community prepared for Christmas celebrations. Margaret had been working on a special project in her sewing room, new dresses for her daughters, constructed from fabric that Mrs. O'Brien had mysteriously acquired during a recent trip to town. "Every child deserves something new for Christmas," Mrs. O'Brien had declared when Margaret protested the expense. "And these girls have been through enough hardship to earn a bit of celebration." The dresses were nearly complete when Benjamin knocked on the workroom door, his expression carrying an unusual tension that immediately put Margaret on alert. "Mrs. Thompson, could I speak with you privately? There's something I need to discuss." Margaret set aside her sewing, noting the formal way he'd addressed her. During their weeks of working together, they'd developed an easy professional relationship that had gradually warmed into friendship. His sudden return to formality suggested serious concerns. They moved to the ranch office, where Benjamin closed the door and took the chair across from her desk, an arrangement that emphasized the gravity of whatever he needed to say. "I received a letter today," he began, producing an envelope from his jacket pocket, "from a lawyer in Millbrook, inquiring about your whereabouts." Margaret felt her stomach drop, though she tried to maintain her composure. "What kind of inquiry?" "Someone's been asking questions about you and your daughters." The lawyer wouldn't say who, but he mentioned unpaid debts and legal obligations that need to be addressed. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She'd thought their desperate flight from Millbrook had ended their connection to that chapter of their lives, but apparently their past was catching up with them, despite the distance and time that had passed. "What kind of legal obligations?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. Benjamin's expression softened with sympathy. "The letter mentions debts to local merchants, unpaid rent, and some question about property that might have belonged to your late husband." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to process the implications. During their final weeks in Millbrook, she'd been forced to purchase food and supplies on credit when her money ran out. The amounts hadn't been large, but to merchants already struggling with the economic difficulties of the time, even small debts represented significant losses. "How much do they claim I owe?" she asked quietly. Benjamin consulted the letter. "The total mentioned is $47.63 plus interest and legal fees." The sum was manageable now that Margaret had steady employment, but it represented a complication that could threaten the security she'd begun to take for granted. If creditors were actively seeking her, There might be legal proceedings that could result in garnishment of her wages or even demands that she return to Millbrook to face civil charges. "What does this mean for my position here?" Margaret asked, getting to the heart of her concern. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing his response carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, your work here has been exemplary. You've contributed more to this ranch's success in 3 weeks than some employees do in years. Whatever financial obligations you may have elsewhere, they don't change the value of what you bring to our operation." The support in his words provided some comfort, but Margaret understood that good intentions couldn't override legal realities. If she was required to return to Millbrook, or if her wages were garnished to pay old debts, it would affect her ability to support her daughters and maintain their current stability. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Figure out what options I have." "Of course," Benjamin agreed. "But Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that whatever you decide, you and your daughters have a place here. This ranch has become your home, and homes don't disappear because of paperwork from lawyers." His words carried a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy, and Margaret found herself looking at him with new awareness. Over the weeks of working together, she'd come to appreciate his integrity, his kindness to her daughters, and the quiet strength that made him a natural leader. The possibility that her legal troubles might force her to leave the ranch and him created a sense of loss that surprised her with its intensity. That evening, Margaret struggled to maintain her usual composure during dinner. Her daughters chattered excitedly about their Christmas preparations, unaware that their security might be threatened by complications from their past. Benjamin and Mrs. O'Brien kept the conversation light, but Margaret caught meaningful glances between them that suggested they were coordinating their support for whatever challenges lay ahead. After the children were settled for the night, Margaret found herself alone with Mrs. O'Brien in the kitchen, ostensibly helping with the next day's preparations, but actually seeking the comfort of the older woman's practical wisdom. "You're worried about that lawyer's letter," Mrs. O'Brien observed without preamble. "Benjamin told me about it." Margaret nodded, grateful not to have to pretend everything was normal. "I thought we'd left all that behind when we came here, but apparently some problems follow you, no matter how far you run." Mrs. O'Brien continued kneading bread dough with methodical precision, her movements reflecting the kind of calm confidence that came from years of managing household crises. "Running from problems rarely solves them," she said matter-of-factly, "but facing them with good people beside you makes all the difference." "I can't ask Benjamin to become involved in my financial troubles," Margaret protested. "He's already done more than enough by giving us shelter and employment." "Child," Mrs. O'Brien said with gentle exasperation, "you're not asking him for anything. But that doesn't mean he won't offer help if he thinks it's needed. That's the kind of man he is." The conversation was interrupted by Benjamin's appearance in the kitchen doorway. "Sorry to intrude," he said, "but I've been thinking about your situation, Mrs. Thompson, and I have a proposition." Margaret felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "What kind of proposition?" "I'd like to advance you the money to settle these debts," Benjamin said directly. "Consider it a loan against your future wages, to be repaid at whatever rate feels comfortable to you." The offer was so generous that Margaret was momentarily speechless. $47 plus legal fees represented a significant sum, enough to pay a ranch hand's wages for months. For Benjamin to offer such an advance to an employee of less than a month's standing spoke to a level of trust and confidence that humbled her. "I couldn't accept such a large loan," she said automatically, though her heart was racing with the possibility of freedom from her past obligations. "It's not charity," Benjamin said firmly. "It's a business investment. You've already proven your value to this operation, and I'd rather keep an excellent employee than lose her to legal complications that can be resolved with money." Mrs. O'Brien nodded approvingly. Makes perfect sense from a business standpoint. Margaret's worth more to this ranch than the money it would take to clear her debts. The practical framing of the offer made it easier for Margaret to consider accepting. This wasn't charity, but rather a business decision based on her demonstrated value as an employee. She could repay the loan through payroll deductions over time, maintaining her dignity while solving the immediate crisis. There would be conditions, she said, her practical nature asserting itself. I'd want a formal agreement specifying repayment terms and interest rates. Benjamin smiled, apparently pleased by her insistence on proper business procedures. Of course, we'll draw up papers that protect both parties and ensure everything is handled professionally. As they discussed the details of the proposed arrangement, Margaret felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to lift from her shoulders. The threat of legal action and forced separation from their new home was being transformed into a manageable financial obligation that could be resolved through continued hard work. But beyond the practical relief, she was struck by the deeper implications of Benjamin's offer. He was committing significant resources to keep her and her daughters at the ranch, demonstrating a level of personal investment that went beyond mere business calculations. "Why?" she asked quietly when they'd finished discussing the loan terms. "Why are you willing to do this for us?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered his response. "Mrs. Thompson, this ranch has been my life for 15 years, but it's never felt like a home until you and your daughters arrived. You've brought something here that I didn't know was missing. The sound of children's laughter, the warmth of family conversations, the satisfaction of work shared among people who care about each other." He paused, then added with quiet intensity, "I'm not willing to lose that because of debts that can be paid, or lawyers who can be satisfied. You belong here, all of you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you can stay." Margaret felt tears threaten at the emotion in his voice, understanding that his offer represented more than financial assistance. It was a declaration of attachment, a statement that their presence had become essential to his own happiness and well-being. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of gratitude too deep for adequate expression. As they finalized their plans for addressing the legal complications, Margaret realized that their crisis had revealed something neither she nor Benjamin had been ready to acknowledge directly. The professional relationship and mutual respect that had developed between them was evolving into something deeper, more personal, and potentially more permanent than either had initially anticipated. The gentle rancher who had rescued them from the frozen well was becoming something more precious than a benefactor or employer. He was becoming the foundation upon which they might build not just security, but happiness, if they had the courage to acknowledge what was growing between them. The week before Christmas brought an energy to the Carter Ranch that transformed the winter landscape into something magical. Snow had fallen steadily for 3 days, blanketing the buildings and pastures in pristine white that sparkled under the pale December sun. Margaret watched from her workroom window as Benjamin and the ranch hands strung lanterns between the barn and main house, their laughter echoing across the yard as they prepared for the Christmas celebration that would bring together families from neighboring ranches. "Mama, look what I made!" Emma burst into the workroom, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her eyes bright with excitement. She held up a paper angel with carefully drawn features and wings decorated with bits of lace that Mrs. O'Brien had provided from her sewing supplies. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret said, setting aside the ledger she'd been reviewing to give Emma her full attention. "Where will you put it?" Benjamin said, "I could hang it on the big tree in the parlor." "Right at the top where everyone can see it," Emma replied, practically bouncing with pride. "He said it's the most important decoration because angels watch over families." The innocent comment struck Margaret with unexpected force. Over the past month, she'd watched Benjamin interact with her daughters with the natural affection of someone who genuinely enjoyed children. But his comment about angels watching over families suggested a deeper level of emotional investment than she'd previously recognized. Sarah appeared in the doorway, flour dusting her apron and her expression, carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd mastered a complex task. Mrs. O'Brien says the Christmas cookies are ready for decorating, and she wants to know if you can spare Emma to help with the icing. Of course, Margaret replied, watching her youngest daughter skip away with the carefree joy of a child who felt completely secure in her world. The transformation in all three girls over the past month had been remarkable, but Emma's change was perhaps the most dramatic. The quiet, withdrawn child who had clung to her mother's skirts had blossomed into a confident little girl who chatted constantly about ranch life and treated Benjamin with the easy affection she might have shown a beloved uncle or father. The afternoon brought an unexpected interruption to their holiday preparations. Margaret was working in the ranch office, finalizing the loan paperwork that would resolve her legal obligations in Millbrook, when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, she could see two riders making their way up the snow-covered drive, strangers whose formal attire and purposeful bearing suggested official business rather than social visiting. Benjamin met the visitors at the front door, his manner polite but cautious as he invited them inside. Margaret could hear voices from the main room but couldn't make out the specific words of conversation. Her instinct was to continue working and let Benjamin handle whatever business had brought the strangers to their door. But something about the timing and formality of their visit created an uneasiness she couldn't shake. "Mrs. Thompson," Benjamin's voice carried a tension that confirmed her concerns. "Could you join us in the parlor? These gentlemen have some questions about your circumstances." Margaret's heart began racing as she walked toward the main room, her mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. Had her creditors in Millbrook decided to pursue legal action more aggressively? Were there other debts or obligations she'd forgotten about? The two men who stood as she entered the room had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement officials, and their serious expressions suggested that this wasn't a casual inquiry. "Mrs. Thompson," the taller of the two men said, touching his hat, brim in polite acknowledgement, "I'm Sheriff Williams from Millbrook Township, and this is Deputy Carson. We've been looking for you regarding some questions about your late husband's estate." Margaret felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet, though she managed to maintain her outward composure. "My husband's estate? I'm afraid I don't understand. David died 8 months ago, and there was very little to settle." "That's what we need to discuss," Sheriff Williams continued, his tone professional but not unkind. "It seems there's been some question about property that may have belonged to your husband, and certain parties are claiming you left Millbrook with items that weren't rightfully yours." The accusation was so unexpected that Margaret was momentarily speechless. David had owned virtually nothing of value. His tools had been sold to pay medical bills, their furniture had gone to cover rent, and she'd departed Millbrook with only the clothes on their backs and a few personal mementos. "I don't know what items you're referring to," she said carefully, aware that Benjamin was listening to every word with growing tension. "When we left Millbrook, we took only our personal belongings." Deputy Carson consulted a notebook, his manner suggesting he was reading from official documentation. "According to the complaint filed by Mrs. Patterson at the Millbrook boarding house, you departed with linens, dishes, and other household items that belonged to the establishment. The value is estimated at approximately $15. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with indignation at the false accusation. Mrs. Patterson, who had evicted them into the winter cold, was now claiming that they had stolen property that had never belonged to them. The pettiness and vindictiveness of the charge was breathtaking in its cruelty. "That's absolutely untrue," Margaret said, her voice stronger now that anger was overriding fear. "We left that boarding house with exactly what we brought to it. Our personal clothing and a carpet bag. Mrs. Patterson can inventory her linens and dishes and find them all accounted for." Benjamin stepped forward, his presence a reassuring solidity beside her. "Sheriff Williams, I can vouch for Mrs. Thompson's character completely. She's been employed here for over a month, and I've found her to be absolutely trustworthy in all her dealings." "I'm sure you have, Mr. Carter," the sheriff replied diplomatically, "but we still need to investigate the complaint that's been filed. Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to return to Millbrook to address these charges?" The request hit Margaret like a physical blow. Return to Millbrook, where she had no allies and no resources to defend herself against accusations made by someone who had already demonstrated their willingness to harm her family. The prospect was terrifying not just for herself, but for her daughters, who had finally found security and happiness. "What happens if she refuses?" Benjamin asked, his voice carrying a hard edge that Margaret had never heard before. Sheriff Williams exchanged glances with his deputy before responding. "If Mrs. Thompson doesn't cooperate with our investigation, we might have to consider more formal legal action. Nobody wants that, but we have a job to do." Margaret felt trapped between impossible choices. Refusing to cooperate could result in arrest or other legal complications that would destroy everything they'd built at the ranch. But returning to Millbrook would mean leaving her daughters behind or subjecting them to the trauma of revisiting the place where they'd experienced such hardship. "I'll go," she said quietly, though the words felt like surrender. "But I want it understood that my daughters remain here, where they're safe and cared for." "Absolutely not," Benjamin said firmly, surprising everyone with the force of his response. "Mrs. Thompson isn't going anywhere without proper legal representation and a guarantee of fair treatment." Sheriff Williams studied Benjamin with new interest, apparently recognizing that he was dealing with someone who had both resources and determination. "Mr. Carter, this is a legal matter that needs to be resolved through proper channels." "Then, let's resolve it properly," Benjamin replied, moving to his desk where he kept business correspondence. "I'll contact my attorney in the county seat and arrange for representation. Mrs. Thompson will cooperate fully with your investigation, but she'll do so with legal counsel present and under circumstances that protect her rights." The sheriff's expression suggested he hadn't expected to encounter such organized resistance to what he'd probably assumed would be a straightforward matter. "That's certainly her right, though it might complicate things unnecessarily." "Complications are better than injustice," Benjamin said with quiet conviction. "Mrs. Thompson has built a new life here based on honest work and good character. If someone wants to challenge that with false accusations, they'll have to do it improperly." Margaret watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. Benjamin was committing significant time, money, and effort to protect her from legal harassment, demonstrating again the depth of his personal investment in her welfare. But beyond his practical support, she was struck by the protective instinct he was displaying, the way he'd positioned himself as her defender without hesitation or calculation. The negotiations that followed established a framework for addressing the accusations that satisfied both legal requirements and Benjamin's insistence on fair treatment. Margaret would travel to Millbrook, accompanied by legal counsel, with all proceedings conducted in open court rather than through informal questioning. The charges would be examined thoroughly, with Mrs. Patterson required to provide specific evidence rather than general accusations. This should take no more than a few days to resolve, Benjamin's attorney, Mr. Hamilton, explained during a hurried consultation that evening. "The accusations are clearly frivolous, but they have to be addressed formally to prevent future harassment." As Margaret prepared for the journey she'd hoped never to make, her daughters gathered around her with the protective instincts of children who sensed threat to their security. Sarah's expression carried the worried seriousness of someone old, enough to understand that adult problems could disrupt their carefully rebuilt world. "Are we going to have to leave the ranch?" she asked quietly, voicing the fear that all three girls were feeling. "No, sweetheart," Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. "This is just something I need to take care of, and then I'll be back. You'll stay here with Mrs. O'Brien and Benjamin, and everything will be exactly the same when I return." Emma climbed into Margaret's lap, her small arms wrapping around her mother's neck with fierce possessiveness. "I don't want you to go away. What if you don't come back?" The question pierced Margaret's heart because it voiced her own deepest fear. What if the legal proceedings went badly? What if Mrs. Patterson's accusations were somehow given credence? What if she found herself unable to return to the ranch and the life they'd built there? "I will come back," she said firmly, making a promise she hoped desperately she could keep. "Nothing in the world could keep me away from you girls, and nothing could make me leave the home we've found here." Benjamin appeared in the doorway, his expression gentle as he took in the scene of family anxiety. "Mrs. Thompson, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They moved to the ranch office, where Benjamin closed the door and turned to face her with an expression of such serious intensity that Margaret felt her breath catch. "Margaret," he said, using her given name for the first time since they'd met, "before you leave tomorrow, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said weeks ago, but haven't had the courage to put into words." Margaret felt her heart begin racing, sensing that whatever Benjamin was about to say would change everything between them. "These past weeks, watching you work and seeing how you've cared for your daughters, watching Emma learn to laugh again, and Sarah grow confident, and Lucy discover her love for horses, it's shown me what I've been missing in my life," he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. "I've fallen in love with you, Margaret, not just with the capable woman who's transformed my ranch's operations, but with the mother who would do anything to protect her children, the person who faces hardship with dignity and responds to kindness with grace." Margaret felt tears begin to gather as she listened to words she'd never expected to hear, expressions of feeling that matched emotions she'd been afraid to acknowledge in herself. "I know this isn't the ideal time for such declarations," Benjamin continued, "but I can't let you face this legal challenge without knowing how much you mean to me. Whatever happens in Millbrook, whatever these proceedings reveal or require, I want you to know that you have someone here who loves you completely and will fight for you with everything he has." "Benjamin," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking, with the weight of feelings too powerful for adequate expression. "You don't have to respond now," he said gently. "Just know that you're not facing this alone, and you have a home here that no accusation or legal proceeding can take away from you." As Margaret prepared for bed that night, her last evening at the ranch before the uncertain journey ahead, she reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. A month ago, she'd been a desperate woman with 3 starving children, facing death in the winter cold. Now she was beloved by a good man, valued by a community, and fighting to protect a life of dignity and purpose that exceeded her wildest dreams. The legal challenge ahead was daunting, but Margaret no longer faced it as a woman alone and defenseless. She faced it as someone with allies, resources, and most importantly, something precious worth fighting for. The gentle rancher who had taken off his coat and said, "Come with me," had offered her more than shelter from the storm. He had offered her love, partnership, and a future bright with possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. Tomorrow would bring challenges, but tonight brought the revolutionary understanding that she was no longer fighting for mere survival. She was fighting for happiness, for family, for the kind of love that could transform even the darkest circumstances into the foundation for lasting joy. The courthouse in Millbrook had not changed during Margaret's absence, but her perspective on it had transformed completely. 6 weeks earlier, she had walked past this building as a desperate woman with no resources and no hope. Now she approached it, accompanied by Mr. Hamilton, a respected attorney whose presence commanded immediate attention, and with the knowledge that Benjamin Carter was prepared to commit significant resources to ensure her fair treatment. The morning was bitter cold, with ice crystals forming on the courthouse windows and the kind of wind that cut through even the warmest clothing. Margaret pulled her new wool coat closer, grateful for the quality garment that Benjamin's sister had unknowingly provided. Everything about her appearance spoke of someone who had found stability and prosperity rather than the destitute woman who had fled Millbrook weeks earlier. "Remember," Mr. Hamilton counseled as they climbed the courthouse steps, "answer only the questions asked, stick to the facts, and don't let anyone provoke you into angry responses. Mrs. Patterson's accusations are clearly motivated by spite rather than genuine belief in wrongdoing." The courtroom was smaller than Margaret had expected, with wooden benches arranged before a raised platform where Judge Morrison presided with the weary authority of someone who had spent decades sorting through human conflicts. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row with her own attorney, a thin man whose nervous manner suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his client's case. Margaret's first shock came when she saw Mrs. Patterson's appearance. The woman, who had been merely stern and businesslike during their previous interactions, now looked gaunt and anxious, her clothes showing signs of financial strain that hadn't been evident during Margaret's residency at the boarding house. The realization struck Margaret that Mrs. Patterson's accusations might be motivated by desperation rather than simple vindictiveness. "The court calls the case of Patterson versus Thompson," Judge Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the small courtroom. "Mrs. Patterson, please state your complaint for the record." Mrs. Patterson rose unsteadily, her hands trembling as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, Mrs. Thompson left my boarding house without paying her rent, and she took linens, dishes, and other property that belonged to me. The value of the stolen items is at least $15, maybe more." "And you have evidence of this theft?" Judge Morrison inquired, his tone suggesting skepticism about the vague nature of the accusations. Mrs. Patterson's attorney stood to respond. "Your Honor, my client has prepared an inventory of missing items that corresponds with Mrs. Thompson's departure date." Mr. Hamilton immediately objected. "Your Honor, I'd like to examine this inventory and understand how Mrs. Patterson determined that these items went missing on the specific date of my client's departure rather than at any other time." The inventory, when presented, proved to be a hastily prepared list of generic household items, towels, sheets, plates, and cooking utensils, with estimated values that seemed inflated for the quality of goods typically found in a modest boarding house. More damaging to Mrs. Patterson's case was the fact that the list had been created weeks after Margaret's departure, rather than immediately upon discovering the alleged theft. "Mrs. Patterson," Judge Morrison said, studying the document with obvious skepticism, "you're claiming that Mrs. Thompson stole these items, but you didn't notice they were missing until nearly a month after she left." I was busy with other things," Mrs. Patterson stammered. "It took time to do a complete inventory." Mr. Hamilton stood to present Margaret's defense. "Your Honor, my client left Mrs. Patterson's establishment with only the clothes on her, back in a single carpet bag containing personal belongings. She was accompanied by 3 young children and had no means of transportation except walking. The practical impossibility of carrying the alleged stolen items should be obvious to anyone who considers the circumstances." The attorney then called Mrs. Kowalski as a character witness, a strategic move that surprised Margaret. The woman who had housed the Brennan family during their wagon repairs had made the journey to Millbrook specifically to testify on Margaret's behalf. "Mrs. Kowalski," Mr. Hamilton asked. "Did you observe Mrs. Thompson and her daughters when they were traveling through your community?" "I did," Mrs. Kowalski replied firmly. "They had one small carpet bag between the four of them, and the children were wearing clothes that were too thin for the weather. If that woman had $15 worth of linens and dishes, she would have traded them for warmer clothing and better food long before she reached our town." The testimony was devastating to Mrs. Patterson's case, but the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Judge Morrison called for a recess and requested to see both attorneys in his chambers, along with Sheriff Williams, who had been observing the proceedings. When they returned, Judge Morrison's expression had hardened considerably. "Mrs. Patterson," he said sternly, "Sheriff Williams has informed me that you recently approached several merchants in town, attempting to sell household goods to cover debts. Would you care to explain how you came to possess these items that you claim were stolen from you?" The question revealed the true motivation behind the accusations. Mrs. Patterson had been struggling financially, had sold some of her boarding house inventory to pay bills, and was now attempting to blame Margaret for the missing items to avoid admitting her own financial desperation to creditors who might be seeking payment. "Those were different items," Mrs. Patterson said weakly, her face flushing with embarrassment as her deception became obvious. Judge Morrison's patience was clearly exhausted. "Mrs. Patterson, filing false accusations is a serious matter. Not only are you wasting the court's time, but you're causing significant distress to a woman who appears to have committed no crime other than being unable to pay rent during difficult circumstances." The judge turned to Margaret with an expression that mixed sympathy with professional irritation at having his court used for personal vendettas. "Mrs. Thompson, these charges are clearly without merit. You're free to return to your current residence, with the court's apology for any inconvenience this matter has caused." But the resolution came with an unexpected twist. As the courtroom began to empty, Mrs. Patterson approached Margaret with tears streaming down her face and an expression of genuine remorse that transformed her from antagonist to fellow victim of circumstances beyond her control. "Mrs. Thompson," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I never should have accused you of theft. I'm desperate. The boarding house is failing, I can't pay my creditors, and I thought if I could somehow get compensation for the missing items." Margaret looked at the woman who had caused her such anxiety and saw not an enemy, but someone trapped in the same kind of financial desperation that had once threatened her own family. The transformation from accuser to fellow sufferer stirred Margaret's compassion despite the stress Mrs. Patterson's actions had caused. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said gently, "I understand desperation. I've been where you are now, and I know how it can make people do things they wouldn't normally consider." "The boarding house has only 3 paying guests," Mrs. Patterson continued, apparently needing to confess her troubles to someone who might understand. "The bank is threatening foreclosure, and I don't know where to turn. When that lawyer started asking questions about you, I thought maybe—" Mr. Hamilton, who had been listening to this conversation with professional interest, stepped forward with a suggestion that surprised everyone present. "Mrs. Patterson, have you considered selling the boarding house to someone who might be interested in expanding their business operations?" The question created an opportunity that none of them had anticipated. Margaret found herself thinking about the boarding house not as the site of her humiliation, but as a potentially valuable property that could serve the growing community's need for temporary accommodations. With proper management and sufficient capital for improvements, it could become a profitable enterprise rather than a failing business. "Would you be interested in selling?" Margaret asked, an idea beginning to form that could solve multiple problems simultaneously. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened with hope at the possibility of escape from her financial obligations. "I would, but I don't imagine you have the resources to purchase it." Margaret smiled, thinking of Benjamin's offer to help with her debts and his demonstrated willingness to invest in opportunities that made business sense. "I might know someone who would be interested in such an investment." The journey back to the Carter Ranch took on a completely different character than Margaret had anticipated. Instead of returning as someone who had merely survived false accusations, she was returning with a business proposal that could benefit everyone involved while solving Mrs. Patterson's desperate situation through legitimate means rather than false accusations. Mr. Hamilton rode with her, fascinated by the unexpected turn the case had taken. "It's quite unusual for a legal proceeding to end with a potential business transaction," he observed, "but it might be the best possible outcome for everyone involved." As they traveled through the winter landscape, Margaret found herself thinking about the circular nature of her journey. She had fled Millbrook as a desperate woman with no options, and now she was returning to the Carter Ranch with the possibility of becoming a property owner herself, someone with the resources and knowledge to operate a business that could serve the community while providing financial security for her family. The ranch came into view as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, its buildings and smoke rising from chimneys, creating a picture of warmth and welcome that filled Margaret with profound gratitude. Benjamin met them at the front door, his expression anxious until he saw Margaret's face and understood that the legal challenge had been resolved successfully. "How did it go?" he asked, helping her down from the wagon while scanning her expression. "For signs of distress. Better than I could have hoped," Margaret replied, then added with a smile that held both relief and excitement, "And I have a business proposition to discuss with you." The reunion with her daughters was everything Margaret had hoped for during the anxious hours of legal proceedings. Emma launched herself into her mother's arms with the desperation of someone who had feared permanent separation, while Sarah and Lucy pressed close with the need to reassure themselves that their family was complete again. "Did you win?" Lucy asked, her young voice carrying the weight of adult concerns that no child should have to bear. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret replied, gathering all three daughters into an embrace that felt like coming home. "Everything is resolved, and we never have to worry about those problems again." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table with the familiar comfort of their ranch family, Margaret presented her business proposal to Benjamin and Mrs. O'Brien. The idea of purchasing and renovating the Millbrook boarding house as an investment property generated immediate interest, particularly when Margaret explained how her experience with both the hospitality business and the community's needs could make such a venture profitable. "It would give us a foothold in Millbrook for our cattle sales," Benjamin mused, his business instincts immediately grasping the strategic advantages. "And you certainly understand what travelers need better than most people." Mrs. O'Brien nodded approvingly. "It would also provide employment for some of the women in town who need work but can't travel far from their families." As they discussed the details of the potential investment, Margaret realized that her journey had come full circle in ways she never could have anticipated. The boarding house that had represented the lowest point of her desperation was becoming the foundation for a new enterprise that could provide security and purpose for years to come. But beyond the business opportunity, Margaret understood that the day's events had proven something more important than financial prospects. She had faced her past, confronted false accusations with dignity, and emerged not just vindicated but stronger than before. The woman who had once cowered before, Mrs. Patterson's authority had become someone capable of offering help to her former tormentor. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as their planning session wound down. "Mrs. Patterson needs work, and she knows the boarding house business better than anyone. If we proceed with this investment, I'd like to offer her employment managing the day-to-day operations." Benjamin's expression showed surprise at her generosity towards someone who had caused them such trouble, But after a moment, his face lit with admiration. "That's remarkably compassionate, considering what she put you through." "She was desperate," Margaret replied simply. "I know what that feels like, and I know what it means when someone offers a second chance. Besides, the best revenge against false accusations is proving that you're capable of kindness, even toward those who wrong you." As the evening concluded and her daughters prepared for bed, chattering excitedly about the adventures their mother had experienced and the new business, plans that would affect their future, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary transformation that continued to unfold in their lives. The gentle rancher who had rescued them from the frozen well had given them more than shelter and employment. He had given them the resources and confidence to face their past, overcome their enemies, and build a future that exceeded their most optimistic dreams. What had begun as an act of mercy on a winter night was becoming a partnership that could span decades and touch countless other lives through their expanding influence and growing prosperity. Spring arrived at the Carter Ranch with the gentle persistence of hope fulfilled. Margaret stood in the doorway of what had once been Benjamin's sister's room, but was now her sewing workshop, watching her daughters play in the yard where wildflowers pushed through the last patches of melting snow. 6 months had passed since that frozen December night when Benjamin had found them by the well, and the transformation in their lives still felt miraculous enough to take her breath away. The boarding house investment had proven even more successful than their most optimistic projections. Under Margaret's business management and Mrs. Patterson's experienced daily operations, the renovated establishment had become the premier accommodation for travelers through Millbrook. The steady income from the property, combined with Margaret's continued work managing the ranch accounts, had created a financial security she'd never dreamed possible during her married life with David. But success in business paled beside the deeper changes that had transformed not just their circumstances, but their hearts. Benjamin's declaration of love, spoken on the eve of her legal troubles, had opened a door to possibilities that Margaret was only now finding the courage to walk through completely. "Mama, Benjamin wants to talk to you," Sarah announced, appearing in the workshop doorway with the knowing smile of a 12-year-old who suspected important conversations were brewing. "He's waiting by the creek with something behind his back." Margaret felt her pulse quicken with anticipation mixed with nervousness. Over the past months, she and Benjamin had developed the kind of easy intimacy that came from shared work, mutual respect, and the growing certainty that their feelings were reciprocated. But they had been careful, taking time to ensure that any permanent commitment would serve the children's needs as well as their own desires. "Tell him I'll be there in just a moment," Margaret replied, checking her appearance in the small mirror that hung beside her work table. The woman who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate widow who had arrived at the ranch months earlier. Her cheeks held healthy color, her eyes sparkled with confidence and contentment, and her dress was one she'd sewn herself from fabric that reflected prosperity rather than necessity. The walk to the creek took her past the vegetable garden where Lucy was teaching Emma the difference between weeds and seedlings, their voices carrying the comfortable chatter of sisters who felt secure in their world. Near the barn, ranch hands were preparing for the spring cattle drive, their easy acceptance of the Thompson women as permanent fixtures in their community, reflecting the natural way the family had integrated into ranch life. Benjamin stood beneath the cottonwood trees where they had often walked during evening conversations, his back to her as he gazed across the water that ran high with snowmelt from the surrounding hills. Something in his posture suggested nervous energy, and Margaret realized with growing excitement that Sarah's observation about him hiding something might be more significant than casual gift-giving. "You wanted to see me," Margaret said softly. Not wanting to startle him from whatever thoughts had captured his attention, Benjamin turned with a smile that transformed his entire face, revealing the man she had come to love not just for his kindness, but for his steady strength, his gentle humor, and his unwavering devotion to her daughter's welfare as well as her own happiness. "Margaret," he said, her name carrying a weight of emotion that made her heart race with anticipation. "I've been thinking about something Mrs. O'Brien said yesterday when she was planning the summer menu." Margaret raised an eyebrow, amused by the seemingly mundane beginning to what she suspected might be a momentous conversation. "What did she say?" "She said this house feels like it's finally complete, with the sound of children's laughter and a woman's touch in every room. But then she added something that's been on my mind ever since." Benjamin paused, reaching behind his back to reveal a small wooden box that he held, as if it contained something precious beyond measure. "She said the only thing missing was making it official, making sure that you and the girls know this is your permanent home, not just a place where you're welcome as long as circumstances allow." Margaret felt tears begin to gather as she understood where his words were leading. The box in his hands could only contain one thing, and the nervous hope in his expression told her everything she needed to know about his intentions. "Margaret Rose Thompson," Benjamin said, dropping to one knee with the natural grace of a man who had made this decision with complete certainty. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you let me be the father your daughters deserve? And the husband you deserve, not just for now, but for all the years we're blessed to have together?" He opened the box to reveal a ring that was both beautiful and practical, a gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in sparkles that seemed to dance with promise. It was exactly the kind of ring Margaret would have chosen for herself, elegant without being ostentatious, valuable without being wasteful, a symbol of lasting commitment rather than temporary extravagance. "Yes," Margaret whispered, the word escaping before she had consciously decided to speak. Then, with growing confidence and joy, "Yes, Benjamin Carter, I will marry you. I will be your wife, and let you be the father my daughters need, and the partner I never thought I'd be fortunate enough to find." Benjamin's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and Margaret was struck by the realization that this strong, capable man was as overwhelmed by emotion as she was. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her hand, and she wondered how long he had been planning this moment. "I love you," he said simply, rising to take her in his arms, with the reverence of someone who understood that he was holding the most precious thing in his world. "I love your strength and your kindness, your intelligence and your beauty. I love watching you work and seeing you laugh with the children. I love the way you've made this ranch feel like a real home instead of just a place where I happened to live." Margaret felt her heart swell with happiness so complete it seemed impossible that one person could contain it all. "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling both new and familiar, as if she'd been waiting her entire life for the right person to say them to. "I love your gentle strength and your patient wisdom. I love the way you treat my daughters, as if they were your own blood, and the way you see possibilities where others see only problems." Their kiss was interrupted by the sound of running feet and excited voices as the girls discovered the romantic scene unfolding by the creek. Emma reached them first, launching herself at Benjamin with the fearless affection of a 6-year-old, who had claimed him as her own months earlier. "Are you going to be our real papa now?" she asked, with the directness that only children possessed. "If that's what you want," Benjamin replied seriously, treating her question with the respect it deserved. "Would you like me to be your papa?" Emma's enthusiastic nod was joined by Lucy's excited jumping, and Sarah's more mature but equally pleased smile. "We've been hoping you would ask Mama to marry you." Sarah admitted, with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had proven accurate. "We talked about it, and we all decided you'd make the best papa in the whole world." Margaret laughed through her tears at this revelation that her daughters had been conducting their own evaluation of Benjamin's suitability as a stepfather. "You've been plotting, have you?" "Not plotting," Lucy corrected with dignity. "Planning. There's a difference." The family celebration that followed brought Mrs. O'Brien from the house, drawn by the sound of laughter and excited voices. Her reaction to the news of their engagement was a mixture of satisfaction and barely contained emotion. "About time," she declared, embracing Margaret with genuine affection. "I've been watching you two dance around each other for months." Both too cautious to admit what was obvious to everyone else. The evening that followed was filled with the kind of planning conversations that engaged the entire household. Mrs. O'Brien immediately began discussing wedding preparations with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, while the ranch hands offered congratulations and teasing that reflected their genuine affection for both Benjamin and Margaret. "When's the wedding?" Jake Morrison asked during dinner, voicing the question everyone was curious about. Benjamin looked to Margaret, understanding that the timing was ultimately her decision. "When would you like it to be?" Margaret considered the question seriously, weighing practical concerns against her desire to formalize their commitment as soon as possible. "Late summer," she said finally. "That will give us time to plan properly, and for the boarding house renovations to be completed so Mrs. Patterson can manage independently during our honeymoon." The word honeymoon created a flutter of excitement among her daughters, who immediately began speculating about where their parents might travel and how long they might be away. The casual way they referred to Benjamin as their future father touched Margaret deeply, confirmation that their family had already formed in all the ways that mattered most. Over the following weeks, wedding preparations became a community effort that strengthened bonds throughout their extended network. Neighboring ranch families contributed everything from flowers for decorations to musicians for dancing, while the women organized a quilting circle that produced a wedding quilt featuring patterns that told the story of Margaret and Benjamin's courtship through traditional symbols and colors. The Millbrook boarding house reopened to great success just as summer reached its peak, with Mrs. Patterson writing weekly letters that expressed gratitude for the second chance she'd been given and pride in the establishment's growing reputation for excellent service. The business partnership had evolved into genuine friendship, proving that forgiveness could indeed transform enemies into allies when approached with wisdom and compassion. "I never thought I'd say this," Mrs. Patterson wrote in one of her updates, "but losing you as a tenant was the best thing that could have happened to both of us. You found happiness beyond anything you could have achieved in my boarding house, and I've found purpose in work that actually serves people, instead of just collecting rent from them." As their wedding day approached, Margaret found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of complete happiness. The contrast between her current circumstances and those desperate hours by the frozen well seemed almost impossible to believe, yet every detail of their transformation was grounded in the real choices and genuine kindness that had made such change possible. The wedding ceremony took place on a perfect August afternoon in the ranch's main yard, with guests seated in chairs arranged beneath the cottonwood trees, where Benjamin had first declared his love. Margaret wore a dress she'd sewn herself from silk that Benjamin had ordered specially from Denver, its simple elegance reflecting her refined but practical approach to life. Her daughters served as her attendants, wearing matching dresses in soft blue that complemented their individual coloring, while creating the visual harmony of sisters who truly belonged together. Emma carried a basket of flower petals, Lucy held the wedding rings, and Sarah stood beside Margaret as her maid of honor, her mature poise reflecting the young woman she was becoming. Benjamin waited at the altar with the patient confidence of a man who had found his life's partner and was eager to begin their official journey together. Mrs. O'Brien sat in the front row with tears streaming down her cheeks, while the ranch hands and neighboring families filled every available seat with their presence and good wishes. The ceremony itself was both traditional and deeply personal, with vows that acknowledged not just their love for each other, but their commitment to the family they had created together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from their guests seemed to echo across the entire valley, a sound of pure celebration that matched the joy filling Margaret's heart. "Mrs. Carter," Benjamin said as they shared their first kiss as married couple, and Margaret felt the rightness of her new name settle into her identity like a key finding its perfect lock. The reception that followed extended late into the evening, with dancing under lanterns strung between the trees and food that represented the best efforts of every woman in their community. Margaret found herself passed from partner to partner as tradition demanded, but her eyes never strayed far from Benjamin, who was fulfilling the same social obligations with the grace of someone genuinely grateful for every expression of support. The evening wound down, and guests began departing for their own homes. Margaret gathered her daughters around her for a conversation she had been anticipating all day. "Tomorrow, Benjamin and I will leave for our honeymoon trip to California," she began, seeing a flicker of anxiety cross Emma's face at the mention of separation. "But before we go, I want you to understand something important about what happened today." She knelt so she could look directly into each girl's eyes as she spoke. "Today didn't just make Benjamin and me husband and wife. It made us a real family in every way that matters. Benjamin is now your father-in-law and in love, and this ranch is our permanent home. Nothing will ever change that." "Even if something bad happens?" Emma asked, voicing the fear that lived just beneath the surface for children who had experienced loss and abandonment. "Even then," Benjamin said firmly, joining their circle and placing protective hands on each girl's shoulder. "Families take care of each other no matter what challenges come. That's what families do." As Margaret prepared for bed on her wedding night, she took a moment to stand at the window of the room she now shared with her husband, looking out over the ranch that had become more than a home. It had become the foundation for a legacy that would extend through generations. The stone well where Benjamin had found them was visible in the distance, its outline barely discernible in the starlight. Tomorrow it would just be a practical structure for drawing water, but tonight it stood as a monument to the moment when desperation had met compassion, when 4 lives had been forever changed by the simple power of human kindness offered without conditions or expectations. "What are you thinking about?" Benjamin asked softly, joining her at the window and wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About how perfect everything turned out," Margaret replied, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. "About how that terrible night by the well was actually the beginning of the most beautiful chapter of our lives." "Sometimes the worst moments make space for the best ones," Benjamin agreed, his voice carrying the contentment of a man whose deepest dreams had been fulfilled. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what really matters." Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the quiet sounds of their ranch settling into peaceful sleep, the gentle lowing of cattle in distant pastures, the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves, the barely audible breathing of her daughters safe in their beds down the hall. These were the sounds of home, of security, of a future bright with possibilities that seemed limited only by their capacity to dream and work toward those dreams together. The gentle rancher who had taken off his coat and said, "Come with me," had given them more than rescue from a winter storm. He had given them love, purpose, community, and the kind of unshakable security that came not from material possessions, but from the knowledge that they were valued, cherished, and permanently woven into the fabric of a life worth living. Margaret drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of their thriving household. She carried with her the profound gratitude of someone who had learned that miracles often wore the disguise of ordinary human kindness, and that the most extraordinary transformations began with the simple willingness to accept an outstretched hand offered in love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.